I just want to welcome everyone to our continuing series of civic dialogues. I see some new faces. I see a lot of returning faces, so this is wonderful. I just want to introduce myself. Many of you know me. I'm Caddy Robinson. I'm the Civic and Community Engagement Faculty Director at College of the Canyons. And I have been working on this Civic Dialogue series with my two colleagues and good friends, Kimberly Rosenfeld and Jan Connell, who are both on the Zoom from Cerritos College. And so, as we've mentioned before, this is a collaboration that started with a Bringing Theory to Practice grant last year between College of the Canyons, Cerritos College, Cal State Northridge, and Cal State Dominguez Hills. And we've been fortunate enough to also partner now with 3CSN, this Community College Success Networking team for California community colleges. So we are really excited about this. Again, we are looking at the topic of civic dialogues, and as you know, this is a 7-part series which is comprised of some amazing speakers, many of whom are considered to be national scholars, researchers, and practitioners in the field of civic and community and democratic engagement, not only in this country, but throughout the world. And I am honored today. It's been an honor introducing David Scobie. I know for Kimberly it was an honor introducing Shalom last week, and we have another person today that I am just so thrilled to have in our presence, Dr. Caryn Musil. Dr. Musil has done just so much work in this field, and she's going to be talking about her work specifically with her work with A Crucible Moment. She has written civic prompts, which she also will be talking about, and has been engaged in this work for literally decades. And I'm going to read the short bio of her in just a moment, but again, I just want to say, Caryn, it is an extreme pleasure to have you here today, because again, one of the leading experts in the field of civic and community and democratic engagement, and we are so honored to have you be a part of this series.
Thank you.
So with that, I want to read Caryn's formal bio. Caryn McTighe Musil began her academic career at Wright Community College in Chicago, where she fell in love with teaching. She has held a distinguished career as a professor, nonprofit executive, educational consultant, scholar, and public speaker. As an English and Women's Studies professor at LaSalle University that had just admitted women, she learned firsthand that changing the demographics was the only way and the best way to the first step to take towards creating inclusive institutions. In July 2020, Dr. Musil retired from AAC&U after nearly 3 decades to become an independent consultant, having served in senior level positions as senior vice president and acting president. While at AAC&U, she directed more than 24 national and global projects involving hundreds of colleges and universities. Her areas of expertise include women, diversity, equity and inclusion, curriculum and faculty development, global learning, institutional change, and civic learning and democratic engagement. Please welcome me and our team as we say thank you so much for joining us today, Caryn.
Well, hello, California. You have been so much in my mind. I have a daughter in Culver City. I know since March, when you became one of the hotspots for all of this, that my eyes were turned to you as they were to New York and so many other places. We now are over 207,000, I think, human lives that we've lost. So it has been a very difficult moment for all of us. But in California, you then got the fires. And my daughter, one morning, when it seemed as if she's, like some of you, a working professional with 2 young children. So that layered on to everything else has made her life harder. And California, at least in LA, got an earthquake. I mean, so it is a time of great trial. It is also a time of great excitement as we watch, I think, America wake up to the threat to democracy, the threat to equality, the threat of racist systems to allowing us to become the democracy that we need to become. So there are very powerful movements where people's voices, from young people, from middle-aged people, from old people like me, across colors, across classes, are really trying to use our voice, our power to create the kind of world that we want to live in, and to have a world that will be there for our children. And so it's really wonderful for me to be part of this Civic Dialogues for all of you, and to be working with Patty. One of the last things I did at AAC&U was write an article for the last issue of Diversity and Democracy, a journal I helped found 25 years ago, that they have decided to end. And in that, the last issue was on civic-minded institution. And Patty has an article in that, and it's one that I would recommend. We'll be sure that gets on your list because it has wonderful, a wonderful range of voices from very different kinds of campuses looking at what would it mean to create a civic-minded institution. I want to thank the human labor I know about, Caddy Robinson, Kimberly Rosenfeld, Jan Connell, for their work in conceiving it. I know Lindsay I've been on the email with her today, trying to be sure I had all my materials in. And I know there are a lot of behind this, beyond the three of them as well. So, and I want to thank all of you who are facing the camera again, or the screen. We will have a new phrase, meeting box to box, that will probably stay with us for a long time. But I'm very, very happy that you took time to be part of this conversation. I did watch David Scobie's introduction, and I'm hoping that many of you saw that. I'm happy these are recorded, because that will allow you to go back and forth. I think you'll hear some echoing between us. David was a member of the National Advisory Board for a Crucible Moment, which I was tasked to be the lead author to compose and resubmit to that advisory board for final exception. And my job was really to listen to the hundreds of people who fed us materials and who gave us materials about what they were doing and what they hoped their institution would do in the future. So I do want to talk certainly about the Crucible Moment. Will be, Patty said, it might be useful for some of you if I said something about its history and what the findings were. It is now 8 years since it was published under the Obama White House in a special program held at the Executive White House. I want to also talk about another key thing that I hope that we can talk about and you can talk about is the way in which diversity, equity, and justice are an inevitable part, need to be an inevitable part of how we understand what civic means. Now, some of you may, I'll preface this by saying, when I wrote my last article, I actually wrote it in October, and they held it for a lot of reasons. They held off doing that issue. There were a lot of other things to do. And in that issue, I think I had a title, Mind Your Business, Educating for, and I don't know what I said. I don't know what kind, educating, I might've just said educating for democracy. By the time I rewrote this, in light of where we are now, in light of the June racial murders that we witnessed, very slowly and painfully on videos, and watched people begin to express their anguish more openly in a way that more people, not in a way, but more people, particularly white people, listened for the first time. I ended up strengthening it because civic, standing alone, doesn't always speak to everybody. One of my very close African-American friends said when we were doing Crucible, she was in a round table, and she said, I happened to mention to people who'd all been doing civic work that she found civic a rather tepid word, and people looked at her askance. And so the adjective preceding my title now is Educating for a Pluralist, Equitable, Truth-Telling Democracy. And I think whenever we can define what we mean by the democracy we want, we will put our particular angle on it. And if we don't have everybody's voice in shaping the democracy we actually want and what we think patriotism is, because we have a president who wants to have a patriotic curriculum, which by his own language means excising almost all the work that my generation has worked for 40, 50 years to put in to a missing curriculum, a missing history, a missing canon of literature, a missing understanding of biology, a missing understanding of psychology, missing ethical questions in education for business, where you think, what are the effects of the business on the people it's supposed to serve? So a whole series of questions that we need to be asking, are have not been there. We work very hard, I think, in higher education to try and continually talk together and listen to each other. So we are creating the kind of country, the kind of communities, the kind of habits of democracy, and certainly the kind of political structures and political representation that is fair and just. So I do encourage you to do that with Civic. So that has always been a very strong part of my coming to this work, through diversity. I'll say a little bit about that. So I'll talk a little bit about Crucible Moment, what that says about the field in 2011 and 12. It came out in 12. We did a lot of the gathering in 2011 and 2010. The imperative to link diversity, equity, and justice, or social responsibility, or public good, whatever will work where your institution is, to our understanding of education for democracy. And then I will talk about the latest efforts by many of you, and I was delighted to do an institute on civic prompts in LA, at Cal State LA, in January 31st, which it was my last visit to California, and in which community colleges and an overwhelming number of the Cal State University systems were there. Between the two of you, you of course have the most diverse student bodies of anyone. You have the gold mine of America. You have the future of who this country is. Sitting in your classroom. And so that is a very exciting role you have to play in particular. So let me just say a little bit about Crucible Moment. And I will personalize that a little bit in terms of, if you'll permit me, a little bit of bio. I think I came to issues of democracy and what I now call civic learning and democratic engagement, first through my privilege and the security of where I was born and into what class and into what place. Grew up in a very small town in Philadelphia where everybody knew each other. And, I was so proud to carry the American flag when I was a brownie. I probably was a Girl Scout by the time I got to carry the American flag. And I grew up with a sense of equity and fairness, and that everyone should have it. I just mistakenly thought everyone did. And that is one of it took me a long time to realize, not too long, but it took me time, and I continue to learn who doesn't have the same full access to the power and privileges of democracy. Yesterday, I was reminded of it. We're getting new sidewalks in our neighborhood. And the man putting in the sidewalks, I was upset because they cut down trees, which they could have gone around, but did not. And the man I was talking to about it is in charge of putting in the sidewalks. And he said, well, I just wish in my neighborhood I had such beautiful sidewalks. Where I live, it's poorer. And it seems like only rich people get these kind of sidewalks. And it's and in that was, and so what are you complaining about? Which I said, you're absolutely right. And that is not fair, and it should be corrected. So in the smallest kinds of ways, I am continuing to learn ways in which we have to do better where we are, so that everybody, has the trees, the sidewalks, the safety, the security, the food, et cetera, that they need to survive and they need to flourish. So I think I came to it always kind of a big believer in democracy. So by the time I'm doing diversity work at AAC&U in a great big capacious 10-year initiative called American Commitments, Diversity, Democracy, and Liberal Learning, I'm reading for the first time Frederick Douglass' What is to Me the 4th of July. Now, I'd learned about diversity in many ways before that, but that was just one more reminder of, and when I was consulting for the Ford Foundation, assessing the impact of some of their early diversity grants, I was being shown around the campus and neighborhood by an African-American older man who was a key connector for them with the community. And we're walking down the street and I look up, we're in, I think, the garden section, and we're at Tulane, and it's there's a big, beautiful live oak tree. And I said, oh, the live oak trees are so beautiful. His response was so dramatically different and he said, well, when I look at a live oak tree, I see a Black man hanging from a tree limb. This is the kind of very different experiences we have all had in living in this country. And all of our associations around race, around gender, around ethnicity, around class, around gender, that all of these around religion will be different and within those groups and across them. So that is another key thing about understanding democracy, that we don't just live in a democracy, we live in a diverse democracy, and right now a diverse and unequal democracy. So how can we work together to make that a democracy for all of us? So, you know, I come from this naivete. I think I move out of it in part from the, I'll put them in chronological, in part from being witness to one of the most important democratic movements of the 20th century, which was the civil rights movement. And one of the places to learn about democracy and how it works and how it doesn't, and who might be the most democratically oriented, you need to look at the organized social movements of people who were denied the full promise of democracy's opportunities. So that, growing up in my college years in the middle of the civil rights movement, I went to Duke, you know, so it's all around me. And I say witness because I didn't then know then or act then to be part of that. I hope I have changed that behavior at this, you know, along the way in my life, and to jump in and to be allies with people who whether they're people organizing to stop pesticides in the fields where you're picking the grapes. You know, Cesar Chavez was one of the key people trying to do that. So I learned a lot by looking at the kind of cries for representation, for voice, for fairness, for an end to violence, for open housing, for fair wages, for good healthcare, for an end to gun violence, from lots of people who were organizing for them. And then, you know, my other way of learning about democracy, and I think you can learn, is not only from my privilege, but from having some of its promises denied to me as a woman. Even though I'm white and I'm middle class, I'm female, and so I am of that generation that came out of college in the late 60s, who were the first to go to law school, the first to go to in the post-war period, the first to go to medical school, and to move into the professoriate. And when we did, there weren't many of us. I was the only woman in the English department. This is English. Oh, I knew my cat would find me. This is Hugo. His tail will probably appear. So that was another lesson that one learns, in the same way that my sense of despair and powerlessness that I have felt at different points in the last month, as the politics heats up, as the fires go on, as you know, as racial violence continues, that sense that there's nothing you can do about it. And I I thought, with all my power, with all my privilege, I feel so frustrated. And some days I'm in a white fury. And I think, what does it mean to be like that 24/7? So, how can we learn from our own experiences to think differently and to find the way to learn from and be empathetic towards people whose experiences are different, and to try to say, what does it mean to be standing there? And what things might I do to make that different? So I actually come to Crucible Moment out of having a professional career in doing a PhD in English that was a women's studies dissertation before women's studies was a field, and teaching my first women's studies course in 1972. At my first, after Wright, I went back and got my PhD, and then my first full-time position was at a Catholic university, LaSalle University, that had just gone co-ed the year before I was born. I mean, the year before I got there. I've lost my train of thought because I just shoved the cat. Sorry, lost the train. So after at LaSalle, women's studies actually was my introduction to diversity, because women's studies became the window to study all women. So by the time I came to AAC&U in 1992, I was actually, they were about to launch the American Commitments big initiative, and I was brought on to run the curriculum and faculty development part. By the end, we were working with more than 400 colleges and universities, really looking at the interconnections between democracy and diversity, and trying to understand the ways in which from the very beginning there has been this drama on the stage between those two things, which is true of higher education. We thought we could start a republic with education, but if the education itself was unequal, the republic would be unequal. In the same way that if we start with a constitution that's filled with inequalities, then we will be wrestling with that for centuries, which we have. So I'd been working 10 years with campuses who understood diversity as a democratic movement. And I am suspecting that those of you on and so one of the things I would urge all of you to think about is, what ways can you connect the people, the places, the programs in classes and out in communities and on campus that are leading with the front edge through diversity, with those who are leading through the front edge with civic. And if you begin to talk to each other, and sometimes it's one and the same, but historically there have been separate offices, separate people, separate staff, separate budgets, and often separate concepts. And until we understand that those two are deeply connected, we won't end up really making the transformative change we can. So when I went into the civic movement, I went into it because we discovered in our work that this thing called service learning was really one of the best vehicles for students to be engaged across differences. And we understood and argued that this was a means for academic excellence, and a means for student success, and a means for deep learning, and a means for greater sense of collective action working together. One of the recommendations of a series of monographs we did under American Commitments was called a senior experience. It wasn't called an internship. It wasn't called a capstone. It was called an experience in justice seeking. We never really got traction out of that one. But in 1995, that is what we said, in addition to students in the curriculum exploring their identity and their relationship to others, comparative stories of being Americans and the different lived experiences, and understanding through your major ways in which diversity and democracy were key debates. We said students need to be working with others, and particularly with communities who've been denied the full access to democracy, to to work together with people, informed by them, to create more just and equitable communities. So by the time I move into the stream that is not coming out of the diversity movement, but it's coming out of a whole series of scholarship on civic learning and civic education, out of politics, most of the leaders of that movement, most of the references to that movement were coming out of people who are white, and most of them, it's sort of self-secluded the way we can. And so I have always been working within that movement to try and build the bridges and open the sluices, intellectual sluices and programmatic sluices between people doing diversity and equity work and people doing what was called civic work. I'm hoping that more and more those two are fully integral and not needing to be introduced to one another. And I suspect your campuses that might be truer. Crucible moment was created when the Undersecretary of the Department of Education, Martha Cantor, who was at, she was a president at De Anza, and it wasn't at De Anza. She oversaw De Anza and a second community college. I'm sorry, I no longer remember that detail. So she comes really out of the community college system, very familiar with that, very eager for higher ed to be an access to democracy and its opportunities, and very aware of the new generation of students coming, and very committed to access and success of all students, particularly first generation students. She put out a call to try and see how higher ed was doing in educating students for democracy. There'd been lots of calls for it from the mid 80s. Well, there'd been lots of calls for it from the GI Bill, which opened access to working class people for the first time, with great resistance from everybody who was convinced it would pollute the higher education and degrade its value. It's very similar arguments. Now everybody thinks that's wonderful and should. It also came, and the other, powerful movement are all these movements for access to higher education that are represented in opening up higher education, so it's open more freely and has a very diverse student population, which it now does. It's probably where you could see more of America than in any other zip code in the world, is where colleges are, though that varies across colleges. And then there was the work of a founding campus compact and the work of service learning, which just exploded on campuses, and the founding of a lot of civic groups and civic journals and civic meetings. So you had a lot going on in higher education around this. And Martha Cantor said, how are we doing? Because there was concern that the first title of Crucible that I offered was civic recession, which was rejected because we were in the middle of an economic recession that Obama had inherited, and they didn't want to cloud the two. But there was this feeling that despite all the education, people were becoming disaffected from democracy, more passive about it, more disillusioned with it, and not participating in the public forms of democracy. So higher education kind of stepped in as one of the places that was trying to alter that. And so our job was to say, what have we done in the last 30, 40 years, depending on where you count its beginnings? And what do we need to do to make it have more impact? In one of the grants that I ran called Core Commitments, Educating Students for Personal and Social Responsibility, we created an institutional survey, the Personal and Social Responsibility Inventory, that measured what it was like being in the institution and how the institution as a whole was doing. And the people who answered it were students, faculty, professional student affairs staff, and academic administrators. So you had the 4 vantage points on that question being answered. And in one of ours, which focused on civic responsibility, one of the things we learned was we were doing really, really well for about a third of the students. We were utterly failing 2/3. A third of them said our civic awareness was expanded, our civic knowledge was expanded, and our motivation to participate had been influenced by the kinds of experiences in colleges, and some of those were in class and some of them were out. And by this time, you had almost half of all students taking some form of service learning, which is not the only, but is a marker. It's a little like graduation is not, doesn't, who graduates doesn't tell everything, but it's a marker. And so we brought people together in a series of national roundtables. We organized them. We had 5 of them. They were organized by different kinds of constituencies. One of them were the practitioners on college campuses. One of them was, scholars, practitioners, and the people off campus as well doing civic work, organizations we often partnered with. Another was with presidents. Another was with public agencies and philanthropists and disciplinary societies. So we were trying to find multiple ways in which we were hearing from the university and colleges what they were doing. We also, as this 6-month period was going on, we would, at every campus we went to, at every conference we held at AAC&U, we would create roundtables and try to learn from people who weren't part of these national ones, what they were doing. And we gathered huge amounts of material of real practical and exciting new programs. And we tried to capture, if you were in charge, what would you change? And what would make it move from 1/3 to even 2/3? So out of that, we found, I'll just quickly do a rundown. We found several things. We found that there was a lot there, and we should be very proud of it. Almost all of the curricular work that had been done, one of the findings was in general education or electives. We had made almost no impact, no inroads into the major. We also found that it was scattershot, that while there was a lot, it was like throwing spaghetti against a wall. Or my friend used to test the spaghetti by throwing it on the ceiling. So he used to have lots of noodles hanging from his ceiling. So that what was happening in the first year course, there wasn't someone thinking, well, what ought to happen next? Or what kind of capstone should you have if you've had these experiences? Or if they're doing all this exciting work in student affairs areas, what should we be doing in our classrooms to reinforce what they're doing there, and the kind of questions they're raising, the kind of dialogues they're having, the kind of programs they're having. So the need for making it pervasive instead of optional. Almost no one had requirements. So, we cite the Portland States, the Tulanes, several that we could find and that were at these tables that actually had it as a curricular requirement. So we wanted it optional, and we wanted it everywhere. That's what the pervasive meant. And we wanted a kind of intentionality so that people were talking to each other who were actually creating this vision. So at the end of Crucible, there is a grid that looks at both the places on a campus, mission statements, public communication, curriculum, both major and gen ed, student affairs, reward system, campus community partnerships, where you would look and see whether different dimensions of civic learning were represented and where you had gaps, because some people had real strengths, and then they realized if we only had a sophomore course, that would lead logically to the major. And so people began to map their campuses to find out where the gaps were. The other major thing I think that came out of Crucible was a reframing of the language, so that we chose not to call it civic engagement. We called it civic learning, and for higher education, essentially saying this has to be about knowledge. It has to be about the reason we all exist, to advance knowledge. So where is it located in the work we do? And we wanted it about engagement, but not just with the place, community, or the people, whoever community might represent to us, but how we related to them in a way that was reciprocal, respectful, mutual, mutually beneficiary. So we called it democratic engagement, hoping that would suggest the kind of equity-minded engagement that we would then have. So Crucible allowed us to put a stake in the ground to say, here's what we've done. Here's the context in which we're doing it. David talked a lot about context, and we do too in chapter 2 of Crucible. Chapter 3 is filled. If you haven't seen it, you can download it. Chapter 3 is filled with all kinds of recommendations of where you could do it even better. And there was this framing we had of the new dimensions we understood, that civic learning was about a civic ethos. It was about civic literacy. What do you know about the history? What do you know about the skills? It was about civic inquiry. What kind of questions need to be asked in your everyday life, within your discipline as an institution, so that you are creating civic-minded institutions. And the last one was civic action. I often call these Celia. So that we would have a vision of, and there is a little frame in Crucible that says what a civic-minded institution would look like. And that is what many of us were writing to in that last issue of Crucible Moment. And I would say, one of the things I did as we published Crucible Moment, though I always call it the People's Document, I then convened 12 organizations that participated in creating it, that were committed either wholly or through significant part of its organization. AAC&U is not a wholly civic organization, but it has a very strong commitment to educating for democracy. Whereas Campus Compact is all about, educating for democracy. So the 12 of us have been trying to answer the critique from the field that we were all doing our work without talking to each other too. And what if we talked and collaborated at a national level, which is what we were asking institutions to do at a local level. And that has been a very useful 8-year that is still going to continue with my leaving. AAC&U, BT2P, and the Bonner Foundation will co-chair that to be sure that group continues to convene. Sometimes we do projects together, but we're really cross-fertilizing our conceptual thinking, sharing where the sources of really wonderful work is happening. And of course, the campuses have been working really hard. We've all said it would be really wonderful to be able to have a grant that would allow us to measure what kind of progress has there been in the 10 years since Crucible came out. We'll see whether that ends up happening or not. One of the and this is the last thing I'll talk about, is civic prompts. The piece, one of the big pieces of Crucible Moment that I thought was one AAC&U could pick up was the challenge to look in the major and to try and see that as untilled acreage in higher education, so that within our disciplines we began to ask questions about equity, about social responsibility, about the impact of the knowledge we were instilling in students or asking them to help co-create, what that knowledge, what the public impact of that knowledge might be, and to think about the public in the use of that knowledge. It is when we don't ask the students that question that we end up with subprime mortgage, predatory loans. All the people involved in that had college educations. They came out of us. And if enough of them had said, because they knew, if you target people as new homeowners who do not realize fully that their mortgage interest will balloon in 5 years and they will be incapable of keeping it, you will start a worldwide, you could start you will ruin their financial future. You will create a neighborhood of empty houses, and you will, with the hedge funds that, or the toxic hedge funds you've sold abroad, create the potential for a worldwide civic recession, economic recession. They didn't ask those questions. And in fact, in business, they were rewarded for getting those loans, because the reward was getting it at the front end, not thinking of the back end. So what would it mean if in chemistry, I was working with a wonderful chem department at Texas Women's University, and one of the films they show, I'm going to forget his name, is the scientist who creates nitrogen, which is used in fertilizer and explodes what is possible in feeding people, because you create better crops, richer soil. He is the same man who uses that knowledge to create mustard gas in World War I. Devastating, we would call it a war crime, biological warfare. If you've ever read Wilfred Owen, you would see the description of those deaths as the horrible things they were. And the students watch this film and then are asked to say, what are the responsibilities of a scientist for the use of his or her findings? So it's, every department has little crevices and angles, and some of them are more central, about what they could ask in terms of ethical questions, of long-range impacts, of the public good that it contributes to or doesn't. What to do if you discover it doesn't. So the challenge for us was, are there campuses that are doing this? And if so, what do they look like? And I guess the very first thing we did was pull colleges together to say, could we even ask these kinds of questions in your departments? Worked with, I think, 12 or 13 colleges and universities, 2-year and 4-year in Chicago, the McCormick-funded grant. And they essentially, after meeting twice, 2 times, and talking and thinking about it, gave us the courage and some language to say, this is an initiative we think could work. And that led to civic prompts, the civic learning, making civic learning routine across the disciplines, which basically challenges departments. It puts the burden on departments, using your disciplinary knowledge or interdisciplinary knowledge, commitments, methodologies, pedagogies, all of which are fairly particular. What are the questions about public responsibilities and social responsibility and ethical implications that could come routinely from what you do? What ones would you need to insert? I will tell you the story of a nursing program who has redone their curriculum, UNC Chapel Hill. They got a small mini grant from us, and they were in the midst of rethinking the framing of their nursing major. And they began, and the biggest difference is they began not to say, how do we take care of the patient, but how do we take care of the patient and understand more about the environment in which that patient lives? Access to healthcare, kind of community, cultural particularities in the way in which they view health, medicine, restoration, the relation of spirit and body, a whole series of things. And what are your responsibilities as a nurse to improve the public environment for public health? It didn't exist before in the nursing, and they now make it an integral part. So it is no longer reproductive caring of a mother and a child, but seeing that in the context of a family in the context of a culture, a family in a context of the community in which you're working, and a context in which what are the stressors on the health of those families, what are the policies that would improve the health of those families, and what can nurses do about it? So they're raising kind of citizen professionals that they didn't do and they could, and it was easier. I mean, they got all excited about it. It made everything, I think, more exciting for them. So the work we have done in the majors, I would say that campuses have looked at What are the issues that come naturally out of your discipline that you'd look at anyway, that you could make more central? One of our campuses at Willamette used to be called a communications department. They now call it civic communications. And they've sort of reoriented everything. So people are they are not only studying the history, theory, methodology of communication, all the scholarship, but the practice of it. How do they do it? In partnership with different community members? How do they do it in partnership with a capital that is, 5 blocks away? In public policies, on radio, in students organizing public debates, they were in the midst of doing a course there on communication in the midst of crises, public crises, when COVID hit. And that course ended up, then being put online in March. So here they are studying the very thing that is so important in the public communication in the midst of that. So their discipline is really helping them be better citizens, whether they become communication professionals or not. And if they're communication professionals, it makes them be better at that as well. So it's looking at the issues that come from your field. It's looking at the pedagogies that you already use. Sometimes it's labeling them as civic or democratic or ethical or public. The scholarship that is accepted or not accepted, the kind of public project-oriented things you could do that would give students more practice in thinking about and enacting what it means to be civic-minded, justice-seeking graduates who are accounting majors or English majors or physical therapists. So it's a very open field. It has just begun, but it has been exciting to do that, to watch what's happening on campus, to see the excitement of people, and to see the emerging evidence from many campuses who have done this of how much more excited the students themselves are to do this work. At Providence College, they had the traditional capstone for global studies where you do the research paper, what they called the mini dissertation. The students said, this just doesn't work anymore because you've got us doing so much more public engagement in this major, but then we get to the capstone and we don't do it anymore. And so 1 year's students, at their own request, did a paper on how to rethink the capstones for that course. So, the students wanted it. That was actually very true. That they were a great motivator at Willamette as well. I see that it's 5:03, and I want to stop and turn it back over to the moderators. And I know that you're going to have an opportunity to talk with each other in the breakout sessions, and I'm going to sneak into one and really hear the conversations, because it's on the ground and it's your rethinking your own field or describing what you already do. I think that has been also one of the great giving voice to the exciting pedagogies, projects, assignments that have emerged everywhere on campus, which actually is part of seeding a much better garden. And speaking of gardens, I'm going to end my comments with a poem. I have my PhD in English, and this is the poem I used to introduce the Diversity and Democracy last issue that I wrote called Mind Your Business. And it comes from a poem, some of you may know it, by Gwendolyn Brooks. She actually is writing it and it's called Paul Robeson, because it is dedicated to him. But she has this phrase: we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. And however many gates, however many fences, however many none of you here, the truth is that is part of our bond. That will be part of our harvest. So how do we be part of each other's harvest in a way that makes it a rich one, a flourishing one for everyone involved? That's the challenge, and that's the excitement of being alive at this moment in America. Thank you.
Caryn, thank you so very, very much. I just want to make one quick comment, and then we want to open it up for any questions that you might have to please put in the chat here, and Kimberly and Jan and I will monitor those. The two documents that Caryn is referring to, A Crucible Moment and Civic Prompts, we will get those links out to you after the session is over next week with the recording. I like to refer to A Crucible Moment as the second Bible. In my world, it really is the second Bible. It's an amazing document. And Civic Prompts is probably the third. And so I highly recommend that you take a look at these documents. But please go ahead. We have time here. I know we got started a little bit late. We were having a few technical difficulties on our end. So please, we can go over the 12-minute or 12 p.m. Time restriction here. Don't feel like we have to stop here. So please go ahead and feel free to write any questions in the chat. I know people are thinking a little bit. Here we go. Oh, somebody just asked me, what's my first Bible for civic engagement? And the first Bible is the Bible. The second Bible is civic engagement. So that's what I meant by that. Caryn, we have one question here, and this is actually coming from Kimberly. Do you have a recommended reading on ethics and civic engagement? And I know that when you were framing this, you were putting this within the context of public good. Mm-hmm. And might you be able to provide a reference or two within this area of civic engagement?
Yes, and this is where Anne, who wrote with Tom Colby, sorry. Yes. Anne Colby is wonderful, C-O-L-B-Y, and some of the research, some of the work coming out of Crucible Moment, turn to some of her work. Lee Kneffelkamp is another one on moral development that is excellent. She unfortunately passed away. I could send you a few links. Diversity and Democracy had some special issues that grew out of that project that were the ethical realities. And I think we have, I'm sorry, he was at Morehead, and then Morehouse, and then he went to Boston, who was a Martin Luther King scholar, who has a wonderful, I'll send you the link of his wonderful graph, and he's African-American, of ethical learning. And he talks about students being at the crossroads of so many conflicting views, and that they have to find their way. And so he talks about how you find your way, and has a wonderful ethical model. And I'll be sure to send that on to you for the links.
Great. Let's see, we have one other question, and then Kimberly, if you want to get the second one here. Now they're starting to come in. I knew they would. Okay, what are your thoughts on the model minority myth and civic engagement?
Well, I mean, one is to understand the mythic parts of it. One of the, I ran an office of women at AAC&U, and one of the last, we had a series, 3 of which were done before I arrived, but there, one on Black women, one on Latina women, and but we hadn't had one on Asian American women. And Shirley Hune did that for us. And part of what she was doing was trying to offer people an understanding of the differentials across groups and within the same groups. And, you know, we may now look at Japanese Americans as, you know, the success stories. And if we don't understand the way in which they were robbed of their own history of disenfranchisement, then we need to read, you know, Takaki's A Different Mirror and many other stories about that. I grew up on the East Coast without knowing we had concentration camps that we called internship camps. So I'm not sure how the two, I'm not sure how to think about how the two connect, other than to use the power of analyzing society and its inequalities in order to create a stronger democracy, to understand ways in which students across races, and that has been used the most with Asian Americans, wouldn't tell the whole story and are probably distorted to begin with. So really how to use diversity as a lever for greater inclusion, and to realize that whoever succeeds, you know, lots of people can be the first to come in, but the cost of that and the likelihood that other people could follow, you know, is not a guarantee. You know, that so I don't know that quite addresses the concerns.
Let's see, just for the sake of time, I know we got started just a little bit late, so we're going to take one more question here. And this one, how did you transform the expectations of campus culture, administrative, pedagogical expectations, to embrace your new approaches?
Well, I think that was part of the goal of Crucible Moment in its institutional matrix that really tries to say this is everybody's business. And if you leave it only to the director of the Civic Engagement Center, if you leave it only to the ethicist in the philosophy course, if you leave it only to the student affairs staff who are doing honors programs, or doing an honors, doing courts, having students, you know, in courts, or student leadership, or student LGBT groups on campus, it won't be enough. So one of the, you know, I think the power of Crucible Moment was its being able to hand that to the key people in power. We in core commitments, educating for personal and social responsibility, in which, you know, civic and diversity, perspective taking, and turning all of this into action. We had a president's group that signed on to that said we want this in our campus. We created a you know, an instrument that would allow you to get an institutional view of that. You know, I think everybody's trying wherever they can. Culture is a challenging thing to change, but I think when you look for what are the real culture change levers, that you really could look at expectations and structures for departments, the reward systems for departments, the hiring of people, the admissions office and who comes, the student success commitments. And I think this is one of the, I think both the lever for people want, I think people understood that if they included more diversity knowledge and practices into the courses, it led to everybody's student success. This is true of civic, and one of the reasons I think a lot of the early civic work got as much leverage as it did is we could prove, we could give a striking and a sort of ever-growing sense of evidence that the students who were asked to have knowledge that could change the world for the better ended up doing better. You know, it's a high impact practice. Those of you who know about that, there's a, if you thread diversity and a civic through, there are some high impact practices that are going to be civic no matter what, service learning, collaborative learning, diversity. but there's others that won't. An opening freshman seminar, a capstone, an internship. You have to make them, you have to shape them. But when they are there, they have even more long-lasting impact on the students, the deliberative dialogues that came out of Pat Guerin's and her colleagues' national research on that. So I think you have to convince people that this makes what they do better. It makes a better institution. It's better for the students. It improves the scholarship. It improves the standing of the university. It improves the community that they're in. And then but it's, I think, sometimes it's nationally, Cal State has people at the state level sort of pushing the whole system to go a particular way. We now have, I'll just say one other thing and then stop on that. There are 3 states, Maryland, Massachusetts, and Virginia, whose accrediting office, and then I want to say something about whose higher ed, Board of Higher Ed has now named civic engagement, civic learning, democratic engagement, they have slightly different language, as an understood requirement of colleges in their state. Now, each of those, touches different numbers of kinds of institutions in their states. And then, so that has a very powerful impact on presidents and on culture. And then in the Higher Learning Resource Accreditation Center, which has 1,000 colleges and I think 12 states, I might have that number wrong. It's huge. It's our biggest accrediting office. They have just passed last February an understood requirement for accreditation will be civic learning. And they have it, they have it in 2 different places. There's a lot of there's a lot of arenas for the institutions to decide how they'll do that and what counts. But it means everybody's now going to be thinking about that for accreditation. So that then becomes a culture change and everybody's got to worry about it. So, I mean, wherever you can push at at a level that'll affect everybody, and then you have to make sure on the ground that when that's enacted, it's really high quality, then you really get culture change.
Yes.
Good question.
And I think those were great comments. And I want to, we're going to transition now to the second part of our presentation. And again, a huge thank you to Caryn for her wonderful presentation. And we welcome you joining our workshop component. So Kimberly, I'm going to turn it over to you. And those of you who have participated before, you know how this works. We're now moving into that second hour. And I know we're a little bit behind, but no fear, no worries, because we got started a little late.